What's up, y'all? So I want to give a quick look back at 2025. Kind of also talk about where we may go from here, and kind of discuss whether or not this is like the calm before the storm. So specifically, I say this because it's been very quiet this month. Not much has happened, whether it's here in the States or internationally. I definitely want to say that there has been some problems, specifically in the news with mass shootings within the past few weeks, both here in Rhode Island and in Australia. And of course, we also have the typical news that comes out of the Trump administration, and of course, the continuation of the conflict in Ukraine and other conflicts around the world. So, with that being said, what's going on here in the States? Specifically, aside from, as I had just mentioned, with some high-profile mass shootings and with what's going on with the Trump administration, continued immigration crackdowns and all of the problems that go on behind the closed doors. Not much has really happened. Life has kind of continued as usual, and kind of just gone at a slow pace. So we got through Christmas season. I had kind of made a smaller previous video, kind of just going through some statistics of the Christmas season and how a lot of people were struggling. A good portion of the population here in this country struggling specifically in terms of trying to afford Christmas gifts and going into debt in order to do so, and still kind of paying off debt from previous seasons and dealing with the whole travel and the expenses in regard to that. I know that's a huge issue here in the States. Things are extremely expensive, especially if you're traveling to many of the larger states. Things can get pretty expensive and very fast. Travel season, always expensive. Hotels, etc. Completely understandable. So yeah, aside from all of that, nothing has really happened that's kind of like stood out in the news. Nothing with the economy that really kind of strikes like concern. Of course, there's always the concerns, of course, with the deficit and the debt. These are just things that aren't really being pushed to the front of the news or aren't really being discussed on like a mainstream level. So I could see why, that's really not really something right now that's really the top of the concerns, because we don't really, nothing has really happened significantly on a national level to where right now in this moment everybody is like on edge. Things are always happening, of course, so don't get me wrong, but just something in terms of being presented in the media. There's cracks all over the foundation. That's widely known, but going forward, let's look into next year. What can possibly happen that's bad that already hasn't happened? There's a plethora of things that could just erupt at any moment. And of course, what we can definitely see is just continued immigration crackdowns, continuing, reduction of freedoms for the individual Americans. There's also been talk about between some in Congress, specifically Congressman Moreno, of trying to strip dual citizenship away from Americans. So there are a lot of problems with the administration here in the country that really do stand out and are concerning going into next year. So really, what I like to focus on is specifically the health of the economy, of course, and just the social aspect of the country. So again, the livelihood of individual Americans. So continuing going into next year, things are not, you could really just look and tell things are not going to get any better for the average American. Things are going to get cheaper. Wages are not going to go up. Problems are still going to be carried over after midnight going into New Year's. Nothing will change on that field. Things will only get worse. Of course, inflation just continues to be persistent, whether or not it's elevated levels, whether or not it's average, doesn't matter. In the end of the day, paychecks and wages aren't rising fast enough to keep up with inflation. Prices continue to climb. Americans are still straddled with debt. Another thing is the federal government is starting to pursue people that are severely delinquent on student loans. So, that is also going to put some stress on households within the country, especially younger households. Um, and there's just no wonder why almost 2/3 of young Americans want to leave the country. So, I know there's people that will agree with me, there's people that will disagree with me. And nobody, is saying that many of these young people just want to abandon the country and they're not patriotic. It's more than that. It has nothing to really do with that. Of course, many people would love to stay here, if they really could, if they really could survive here and build a life long term. But what sometimes I think that older generations, especially I would not so much all Gen Xers, but early on, people born in a specific area, going into older generations, I think sometimes they are out of touch in terms of how much has changed. Whether or not it's their fault or not, I'm not saying it is. Things change very quickly, and it's a modern society. Even 50 years ago, things were changing fast. Things are still changing fast. And sometimes it's very difficult for people to be able to play catch up in terms of not only doing everything they have to do in life, but also having to kind of learn all these new changes. For example, 20 years ago, right? There was no such thing as a smartphone as what we see it today. Look at today, all the technology, the VR headsets, the Mac laptops, and all this crazy technology that really did not exist 20 years ago. And, somebody who was, again, I was 10 years old 20 years ago. I was playing with computers and phones. Look at today. Yes, I'm still young. I keep up to date with the technologies. I'm very, fluent in terms of technology. But there are people who were 50 or 60 years old that are still, alive and well today that have just not really been able to kind of keep up with these technologies. And even people that were younger back then. So, things are very difficult for people to kind of play catch up with. And that goes not only just in that technology as the example I'm using, but also in terms of economic means and social, how people we look at jobs, for example, how we look at like work culture and hustle culture. The kind of the thing in the past was, you got to work hard and it will pay off in the long term. So if we go back to the 70s and 80s, it was, get a good job, work as hard as you can, save and invest some money. You could buy a house easily, a lot more easier than it is today, a lot easier than it is today. And, you kind of had a life that was almost to an extent guaranteed. And it's not so much anymore. And I think sometimes when, especially the baby boomer generation kind of looks at, they see how they kind of were able to build a life, they expect that life to be kind of carried over to today's generation. So they say, well, when I was your age, I was able to do this and I was able to do that, so now why can't you do that? But we also have to think that not everybody, it's not only just taking an economics class, for example, but not everybody studied economics. Not everybody studies economics. Not everybody went to school for economics. So, we can't expect every American to be, I guess a quote-unquote economist or have any, kind of experience in terms of knowing, like, a baseline of economics. You just can't expect people to know how things actually are. Everybody has so much going on in their lives. We all do a ton of things. We all have our own skill sets and jobs, and we just, sometimes don't have time, and we really kind of get lost in life and we just don't know certain things. For example, I'm not a doctor, so you can't trust me to do surgery on you, for example, right? So you can't trust the average guy who maybe worked in a factory or maybe was a HR manager to kind of tell you about economics, for example. You just can't. And so that person who doesn't know about economics may have that viewpoint where it's like, I'm 60 years old and you're 20 years old and your generation is just lazy because you guys don't want to work as hard as we did. And that person just may not know They may have an idea, of course. I mean, they've lived 60 years, so I'm sure they have an idea that things have changed. But to an extent, they do not have that in-depth experience and knowledge of economics and why things are changing and how fast and how bad actually things are when you really look at the intrinsic details. So, that's that. And of course, things are changing, and things will continue to change. We're going, now we're more than halfway through the decade now. We're going to go into the 2030s in a few years. Things are rapidly changing. Society is changing. People's views are changing. And, before we know it, we'll be in an entire different world. We are today an entirely different world than we were 5 years ago, and 5 years before that, and on and on. So yes, things are changing. This year was a hell of a year. Next year will be a hell of a year. Things are going to happen, whether they're good, they're bad, but we really have to kind of, keep track of what's going on and really kind of take that knowledge and go forward with it. It's really, imperative that we kind of look out for each other, whether it's our family, our neighbors, etc. Because it's, again, we as a society cannot continue to innovate. We cannot continue to grow. We cannot continue to survive and exist and actually flourish if we aren't, meeting those kind of responsibilities to our neighbors, to our families, to our community. And I think that's what the United States is lacking. It's just lacking that kind of communal way of life that it used to exist, like back in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. Of course, things change. Things can't stay the same forever. Economies change. Economies grow. Countries grow. They die. That's just how it is. There's countries around the world that are, have more economic growth in store for them over the next 20, 30 years than this country does. So, we really can't, hate on things. We really can't, assume things, speculate things, and long for the past, and, dislike the future and speculate, whatever. We can't do that. Excuse me. We are in the present now, and we have to really go forward, and we have to take it time by time, day by day, week by week, whatever it is. But we have to live in the present. We learn from the past, and we need to use that and apply it so that we can create and build a future that works for everybody. That's essentially my message. I know it's, easier said than done, very difficult to actually implement, but we have to try. That is kind of where we are here, but we really have to look at the big picture. We have to look at the realistic picture, and that is the United States is extremely unhealthy economically, and socially, and in terms of crime, and in terms of its government and corruption, and etc. So we really have to take all of these into account and realize that things are changing, and they are not changing the way we kind of would hope they are, and things are not doing good. And I hate to be like a pessimist. I always say this. I hate to do it. It's extremely important to be optimistic because, again, this is the United States. We are supposed to be like a beacon of hope for other countries. And lately I've been talking to some people around the world and other countries who share this idea, even from their perspective, that, we are a dying country. And that's from people that don't live here. That's from people that kind of see it from the outside looking in. And the people who are looking from the inside at the real actual picture that is happening here have even more of a pessimistic outlook. So, we really have to kind of try to change that look. And I think that's kind of my message for the new year, that we really need to, kind of put forward something that can work for everybody. And we really need to work at building up our community, taking care of ourselves, whether that's our health or financial situation, and really try to kind of get along with one another so that we can build a nation that is still progressing into the future the way that we have kind of built this progress in, kind of the near past. So, that is essentially what I wanted to say. Again, I want to wish all of y'all, an amazing New Year's. I know it's been a long year, and it's been tough for everybody, but let's try to be optimistic about this new year and about the things that we can all accomplish, not only in the national level but in our own lives. And yeah, I mean, it's essentially it. You have less than 2 days now, even depending on where you are in the world, less or more. But yeah, I mean, essentially, I'm kind of just bringing the year to a close on my channel, and of course, I will see all of you in 2026. Extremely optimistic, trying to be, at least in terms of not only of course, my life, my community, my channel, but of course, just the world and the country in general. So I'll leave y'all with that. Again, I want to wish y'all a happy new year, and I will see all of y'all in 2026. Take care, have an amazing New Year's, and see y'all then.